Hi, I'm Rodrigo Barahona, and I am the book review editor for the Psychoanalytic Quarterly. What follows is my interview with Eve Watson, who reviewed the book From Another to the Other, the Seminar of Jacques Lacan, Seminar 16, translated by Bruce Fink. Eve Watson is involved in psychoanalytic practice, training, education, and research in Dublin, Ireland. She's the co-director of a busy Dublin city centre practice and has published numerous essays on psychoanalysis, sexuality, film, culture, and literature. Her co-edited books are Freud's Principal Case Studies Revisited, Freudian Lacanian Psychoanalysts Reconsider the Legacy, Critical Essays on the Drive, Lacanian Theory and Practice, Clinical Encounters in Sexuality, Psychoanalytic Practice and Queer Theory, and the forthcoming collection on James Joyce's writings in 2026. She is the academic director of the Freud-Lacan Institute and was the editor of Lacanian, the International Journal for Lacanian Psychoanalysis from 2016 to 2024. She's a member of the editorial boards of Lacanian, the Psychoanalytic Quarterly, and the European Journal of Qualitative Research in Psychotherapy. In 2022, she was the Erickson Scholar in Residence at the Austin Riggs Center in Stockbridge, Massachusetts. She is currently the Burns Scholar in Irish Studies at Boston College. Hope you enjoy the interview. Welcome, Eve.
Thank you, Rodrigo. I'm delighted to be able to speak to you this evening about this seminar of Lacan's. Thank you for the invitation to do so.
So I think one of the interesting things about asking you to talk about the seminar is that you've reviewed the seminar for the quarterly. And so we're not necessarily asking you to talk about a work of your own, but rather your thoughts on somebody else's work, and it's many people's works. I mean, in one sense, it's Lacan's seminar. It's a Seminar 16. And it's also Bruce Fink's translation, and then I think maybe Jacques-Alain Miller had some involvement as the editor. So you're reviewing the sort of the whole thing, the whole product, and I wonder maybe if you could say something about what that process was like for you to review this seminar, and seeing as it's, it has to do with the content of Lacan's thinking at that time in the seminar, and also at the same time Bruce Fink's rendering, the translation. I wonder if that made it a different kind of a review, or if there was anything about that made it just particularly interesting in itself.
Well, it was most definitely a different kind of book review for me, in the sense that I have not been in a position before to review an entire seminar of Lacan's. And it is, when you invited me to do so, I took it on because I saw it as a very interesting challenge, and an intimidating challenge, I would say, to read the entire seminar as it was translated by Bruce Fink, and then offer a review of that that would hopefully be of interest to the readership of the Psychoanalytic Quarterly, who are by definition not necessarily Lacanian and not necessarily that interested in the work of Lacan either. So it seemed to me to be, I suppose I was intrigued by your request to review it, and really took it on as a challenge to both read through the seminar for myself, which I wanted to do, and then to produce some kind of a writing about it that would be of interest to the readership of the Psychoanalytic Quarterly. So some might call it foolhardy to have taken that on. But I did, and fortunately you gave me a good amount of time in which to do it. And my method of going about doing it was effectively to read one lesson a week. The seminar itself is comprised of 25 lessons. This was a year-long seminar of Lacan that he conducted in 1968 and 69, that academic year. So I was more or less able to follow a schedule of reading one lesson a week, and take the time that was necessary to be able to read each of the lessons, which in themselves are quite lengthy, up to 20 pages each in some cases, some a bit more, some a bit less, and then do some background reading that is always required when it comes to Lacan's seminars, because he's constantly drawing from other sources. And so to be able to read a seminar effectively, you must also look at those other references that he draws from. Sometimes he extrapolates upon them, sometimes he doesn't. At the beginning of the seminar, for example, he talks quite a bit about Pascal's wager. So work to be done there to review that and consider that. I also benefited significantly from the fact that there is another translation of the seminar that has been done, translation of the seminar into English by an important psychoanalyst, Cormac Gallagher, who is very important in Lacanian psychoanalysis in Ireland, and who attended Lacan seminars and recorded them. And he's translated the seminars into English and made them available. And in addition, offered commentaries on the seminar. So I also benefited from reading Cormac Gallagher's commentary on the seminar, which was immensely useful. And you'll see references to that in my book review. So that's more or less the way I went about it, and that seemed to work well enough. Taking notes as I went, and then formulating a structure in terms of how I wanted to assemble the review, and well, the end product is what you see.
Sometimes, I mean, the structure of what it is that you wanted to cover for the review seems like such an important part of the review process. And I think with single works versus, for example, edited works, when one is reviewing somebody's text, one often finds a through line and then begins to discuss that to see how it's developed throughout the work. And in this case, it's a seminar, and the seminar lasted many weeks. I think maybe you can tell us a little bit more about how many weeks and the whole idea of the seminars that Lacan was conducting at the time. But it was a massive book, and it was a book that covered quite a lot, and it took a long time to be able to, go through it and sift through it. So I'm wondering, how did you think of structuring it in terms of the content? How were you able to, of all the things that Lacan must have touched upon, how were you able to think about what was the most relevant, at least for the reader, to be able to to find interesting, for you to be able to go into some depth on in the review?
Well, I have to say I benefit from being a reader of Lacan for 20 years now. So, I mean, one would not go into this kind of a project without having, a strong background and knowledge in the work of Lacan. Anyway, it would be far too difficult to undertake that without, having some knowledge generally, for example, of where Lacan was at in the late 1960s, what was happening, for example, with his psychoanalytic group, what generally was going on in the psychoanalytic field and in the broader field at that time. So, all of those things matter when it comes to looking at a text like this. And there's some very good biographical accounts of Lacan as well that is possible to draw from. But I went into it with a general sense of some of the themes that Lacan was interrogating at that time and re-interrogating. The theme of the big other, the theme of the subject. These are themes that he's interrogating throughout his work, and often with significant differences from, say, the early period of his work in the 1950s, the middle period, which is often assigned to the 1960s, and the later period to the 1970s. And this seminar is coming at an interesting time in the late 60s, moving into the 1970s. So I think that's another reason why I was drawn to this seminar, seeing it as it is on the cusp of the middle and later periods of Lacan's work, where he is radically revising these key themes that have been with him since the beginning: the subject, subjectivity, the big other, jouissance, to name three off the top of my head, and the implications of those, of radically revising those key themes, really changes what he's doing and where he thinks psychoanalysis is going and what it should be aiming at. And people often find their way into Lacan's psychoanalysis, and it's the later work that he does. And I think this is very interesting because it's in some way bridges that earlier period and later period. I'm not the biggest fan anyway of dividing up Lacan's work too rigidly into those periods, because there's certainly some of his early work that carries all the way through. But at the same time, I think it is very helpful to think of the evolution of Lacan's thinking. And in some ways, I try to touch on that in the review itself. These are some of the ways that Lacan's thought has evolved as a consequence of his years of work and practice, as a consequence of his organizational work, and at that time, the difficulties in his école, which really were very significant in 1968 and 1969. A lot of unrest, and a lot of unrest generally, it has to be said, in Europe at that time.
I wonder if you could say a little bit more about that. I think amongst Lacanians, of course, the divisions between the schools, that he was involved with, were very well known. And his relationship with the IPA, also the rupture that he had with them, and then the forming of his own schools, and then the ruptures within those schools. For the readers, that don't know too much about those details, I wonder if you could say a little bit about that, about what was going on in particular at this time, 1968, 1969, what was going on in the world at that time, and how that might have shaped his thinking, maybe, or even shaped what he was trying to communicate in this book. It seems like the book, the seminar, in particular in the way that it ends, and maybe I'll ask you a little bit more about that also. There's a lot of his personal life that is he's trying to communicate a lot of what's in his personal life as well. There's something personal about him that he's trying to communicate, as well as something that he's trying to transmit in terms of his teaching. So I guess I'm wondering about that. What was going on in the world, in the world context, in the French context, in the context of the psychoanalytic scene there, in Lacan's life, and how did that show itself in the seminar?
Yes, well, the split with the IPA was huge, and at that point, by 1968, it had been in place for 5 years? 68, so 4 years, 5 years. And so the school that he had set up with the founding act, that he, which is I suppose, the document with which he set up the école in 1964, had been going for a number of years. And he had become disillusioned with it, with its workings. And also, he was propelled by a younger group who was attending his seminar, with fresh, radical, perhaps revolutionary ideas, as was the case, as Europe in the late 60s was a hotbed of radical and revolutionary thinking, looking to overthrow the status quo. So he had eager, enthusiastic, younger people wanting to find their way into psychoanalysis, hitting up against a more orthodox, older group in his school, and he's trying to manage that, and that's all going on in the background as this seminar is unfolding, as the weeks go by, from the first lesson, really right through to some of the much later lessons. So that's bubbling away in the background, and And Lacan is very involved in it, and he is the master, and he's very hands-on, and eventually that is resolved, as happens so often in the field of psychoanalysis, if you want to call it a resolution, with a split in his school, where and things are heading that way as the seminar is unfolding, and that's effectively what happens by the end of the year, where Lacan effectively sides with overhauling the school and bringing in a better way of running the pass, what was deemed to be a fair way of the pass, and effectively sidelining those senior analysts who had been, in a very powerful place within the organization, and they weren't happy about that and weren't happy about the changes. So a number of them left. So it was a turbulent time, to say the least, in Lacan's school, mirroring a turbulent time in France, in particular, with the student protests and the build up to those, and a real awakening of I suppose youthful protest against what was deemed to be a world out of time, out of sync with the experience of those actually living within it, particularly younger people.
Yeah, and then within the institutes themselves, I'm not sure if what you're saying is that, well, there's a past, that the procedure, we can call it that, of the past was sort of at the center of it. I'm not sure if that has to do with authority and perhaps something going on in the institutional life or cultural life to do with the younger generation or authority or authorizing who's got the authority to be an analyst.
Right.
Could you say a little bit about what is the past, and perhaps what was more specifically, what was what were the feelings of what was going wrong with the first school that they needed to have these revisions?
Well, it's an interesting question, and it's a very complicated question actually, as to how, in a way, it shouldn't be complicated, but there are iterations of the past coinciding with iterations of the school. Effectively, the past is just as you described, which is a way in which a person goes from being an analysand to an analyst. And it is a procedure within the school whereby the person is expected to testify to elements of their analysis to a group of passeurs, who will then make a determination on whether they are successful or not. I mean, that's the very simplest way of describing it. And indeed, many psychoanalytic groups and schools around the world have versions of this in some way or other. The trouble that was there at the time of this seminar was really centered around Lacan's own involvement in that as the master, and being involved as one of the jury members, and the influence that he had. That was certainly one significant factor. That it made it very difficult for the other jurors to vote against Lacan, as you can imagine. So one of the consequences of the overhauling of the rules within the school, and the overhauling of the school itself, was Lacan agreed to step back and reduce his involvement in the juries, but also there was the senior analysts would also have much less of a role in that, and there was disagreement about who could be designated a senior analyst, if you will, and who wouldn't be. And so those advocating for a hierarchy within the school, and Lacan himself on the side of the disillusion of hierarchy, which has always been a feature of his way of doing things. And one of his great arguments with the IPA was its use and application of hierarchical structure. I mean, there were other arguments that he had with the IPA. That's not the only one, but he was really anti-hierarchy, and while at the same time, paradoxically, involving himself and over-involving himself, which by definition includes some level of hierarchy. But in the main was against it. He saw that as being anti-psychoanalytic. So the past has a storied history, and in fact, in Ireland, in the Irish context, in the group that I'm involved in, which was a group set up by Cormac Gallagher, APPI, APPI, we actually don't have a version of the pass. We don't do the pass. We have a different, we don't ask those who are seeking to become what are called registered practitioners to testify to their own analysis to a small group of their peers, but they testify about their work and their practice and their relationship in that way to the unconscious through their work, but not directly through speaking of their own analysis. So I'm actually not directly experienced myself with the past. So there are others who are and who can speak to it more effectively than I do. But as a small country, Ireland is a very small country. This is my understanding. I wasn't around when the organization was set up, but my understanding of it is that to have people testify directly about their analysis to a small group in a very small country where many people know each other would simply be too risky. So this other method has been adopted and adopted quite well.
It's very interesting. The idea of testifying to one's own, I guess that's one's own past, I suppose, through one's own analysis. Something about I guess it's something about that. It's not just do you pass or fail, but rather you're passing through a process, and to testify about how you pass through your own process in analysis. And then maybe the version that there is now where you're just talking about your cases and perhaps about your own unconscious in how it relates to the work that you're doing, and then you're presenting on them. It seems, I wonder if in a way it's comparable now, at least this version in Ireland, to what we have here in the United States with the American Psychoanalytic Association. Actually, I think it's now it's separate. It's not a function of the American Psychoanalytic Association, but the certification exam that people need to take after, or they have the option of taking it after they graduate. But many institutes require this certification in order to be able to then apply for senior roles in their institute to become training analysts, and that the certification is a process where you go and you present 3 different cases to essentially a jury, 2 other people or 3 other analysts in a private setting. This is a big country, so you tend not to know anybody that's involved in the process. And you talk about your work in a way that they expect, and that the expectation is that you talk about your involvement as well in the work, the way that you can be subjectively pulled into the work, or things that have to do with your own subjectivity, your own unconscious, and how it relates to the work. So it's not just you're taking an exam or you're talking about your case, but you're really talking about your own process when you are working with your patients. So probably not the same, but it seems as if there is, in some ways, even here, we have this question of how it is that we authorize people to then be not just analysts, but teach, I guess, didactic, to be the ones who then transmit the knowledge.
It's a very similar process, I think, as you've described it there, to the process that we have. But it is a very important question of what this business of authorizing who may use the title of analyst, and of course that is also dependent on what the title of analyst means in the particular jurisdiction in which that we're talking about.
Yeah, yeah,
It means
yeah,
different things in different places, psychoanalyst.
yeah. That is true. And for Lacan, it meant something different too. I think in his mind, would perhaps it meant something different than what he thought the IPA with their hierarchies and rules, how they define perhaps what it means to be a psychoanalyst.
Mm.
I wonder if I wonder, so thinking about the seminar itself, what was your sense of what he was trying to transmit to us or to his audience, to the people that were listening to him and to his readers? I know that this was transcribed from oral presentations. I'm not sure, actually. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about that if he ever intended for these seminars to be published. But whatever the case was, what do you think he was trying to tell his viewers or his listeners?
Well, it's possible for each of the years of his seminar to identify an overall theme. Sometimes he announced what the theme was going to be, so that was easy, or he'd give it a title. So we have seminars on transference, on ethics, on desire, on anxiety, the four fundamental concepts of psychoanalysis, the psychoanalytic act, and so on and so forth. So generally, Lacan announced what the title is, and often the year at the end of the previous year, he would announce what the next year's seminar was going to be. And usually he followed up on that. This seminar follows a seminar that is called the Psychoanalytic Act, and it is before his 17th seminar, which is the other side of psychoanalysis, which has been translated into English for quite a while now, and is one of the more well-known of his seminars. And it's where he talks about the different discourses, the discourse of the analyst, the discourse of the master, the discourse of the hysteric, and the discourse of the university. And that has been sort of read for quite a long time, for several decades now. So this seminar is prior to this. So it's useful in terms of context to be able to read this seminar and think, how is Lacan building up to formulating his discourse theory? Where in this seminar can we see how he's doing that? And I think it is very possible to see his work on discourse and on the big other, and later in the next year, how it will be more carefully formulated into the discourses. And it begins, I suggest, at least according to my reading, with his ongoing review, which is clear here and continues, I think, for the rest of his seminars, his ongoing review of the big other, of the what generally speaking, and by the big other he's referring to the field of speech and language, the symbolic field, history, culture, laws, convention, the symbolic field. And he is revising this and really leaving behind the field of structuralism, which he had borrowed so heavily from earlier on to formulate his idea of the unconscious structured as a language. And this is very important in terms of thinking of the repressed unconscious in terms of signifiers, and thinking about it in linguistic terms. And his difficulty, the difficulty that arises for him in terms of thinking so heavily in terms of a structuralist approach, is that it is in effect an all-encompassing system. The problem he'd sort of gotten himself into is that if you think about how structuralism works, it is a system that is an enclosed, all-encompassing system, and that's problematic because it does not make room for the singularity of the subject, and that we're not all determined by this symbolic realm. So there's two things in what I just said, that we're if we were to be all determined by the symbolic realm, we would be able to get to the ultimate truth of the of that's how it would work. And he makes a very clear argument in this seminar that, and he refers to it in his own way as the signifier of Lacan the other, which is a way of saying that it is not possible to get to the whole truth. It's not possible to articulate the whole truth, and it would be possible, strictly speaking, if you were to approach this structurally. So we see that move away from what was moving towards a very all-encompassing big other, and he had already made an important definition some years earlier. There is no other of the other, meaning there's no all-encompassing symbolic system. Because there is something else that commands the system that is outside of it, and that is the real. That is the dimension or the register of the real, which he's also presenting in various ways in the seminar here that we're speaking about. So the real is, and I think that's why he draws, for example, from something that might seem particularly obtuse, Pascal's wager, and he spends quite a long time getting into the detail of Pascal's wager, and it is not the easiest of reads, it seems to me. Others may disagree with me on that, but I didn't find it to be so. But it seems, at least according to my way of thinking about it, that this is important in that he's not so much interested in he's interested in Pascal's argument, but he's particularly interested in his method, if you will. This is not Descartes' method around the thinking man, but it is a method where Pascal arrives at the thought that it's neither possible to prove nor disprove the existence of God. That's well known to most people who can look up what the wager is about. So the best bet is to assume that God exists. And this seems to be what most of us would recognize fairly quickly as a very clear anti-empirical turn. That this is an argument that rests on, well, we'll go with the one that seems. It seems we might as well just go with the one that suggests that God exists, but without there being, clear and absolute proof one way or the other in terms of the argument. And it seems to me that should listeners get the idea that Lacan is taking a religious turn in exploring Pascal's wager, that's not what he's doing. I think he's presenting the idea that, well, we might as well settle on the idea that God exists. This is another way of asserting the role of the real, that there's something else out there that functions as a kind of prime mover, as something that is outside of the symbolic field, but nonetheless commands it, because it is not a closed field, as would be the case in a structuralist approach to it. So he takes Pascal's argument to ultimately, similarly arrive at a way of discerning the function of the real, just as Pascal, discerned ultimately the role of God in adjudicating things.
So then, I wonder: is this a phenomenological argument, or is this something related to intuition? There's something there about sort of sensing, or it's not a deductive argument. I think is one of the things you're telling me. It's not a Descartesian argument, but there's something about taking it on faith that there's something outside of there that determines something about who we are subjectively, but we can't capture it in language. And it's not accessible. Nevertheless, we sort of agree that it's there. Do you see what I mean? It sounds Like there's
Mm.
something of an intuitive argument in there.
Yeah, something more inductive than deductive, we might
Perhaps,
say.
yes.
And again, that's about moving away from, as psychiatry is moving away from dynamic psychiatry and moving into the more empirical world, and from whence we firmly are today, you could say.
Mm.
But yes, it's Pascal's method that he's
Yeah.
particularly taken with, and it is a more inductive method, and that is, I think, a, 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 a way of setting out how we can uh, um, think about not just the real, but the unconscious as well. Um, it's not within. We don't approach the unconscious through the strictly empirical method, do we?
Well, I mean, so then there's something about listening. The listening must change. That clinically there has to be I'm wondering there has to be implications. I mean, was Lacan in some sense also making a clinical argument with the register of the real now, for example, or perhaps just the idea of the lack in the other, or perhaps that's something along the lines of lack in the symbolic order. And not everything can be captured by the signifier, or perhaps not every. I wonder if that means that we're not listening in the same way to our patients. Are there clinical implications for thinking about this?
There are, because I think this idea of the lack of the signifier in the other, or the lack in the signifier, you could also describe it as such, is also a way of
Mm-hmm.
saying it's a signifier that has not yet come to be, which is also pointing towards something that is open rather than closed. So I think that has very important clinical implications, that it's possible for there to be a signifier that will um, um, offer a way to say something about the truth, and the signifier has not yet been formulated, has not been said. I think that's radical. um, and and I'm thinking back to my own training, and thinking about the emphasis that was placed during my training, and rightly so, on what are the signifiers in what the patient says. What are they? Have you heard a and the excitement when a signifier was not only identified but maybe affirmed then in supervision. Yes, you might be on the right track. And then, and that's fine. But I suppose what I read into this is, that sounds a bit like, that, and we're talking about master signifiers here, and being able to articulate them is very important for the patient, but that there's yet a master signifier to be said, to be found, that will carry the weight, that will carry the burden of suffering, that will carry the burden of truth, and do something new and surprising for the patient. I think that is clinically very important.
It's related to this. Is it the analyst's task, or perhaps it's the task of the analysis to construct that signifier, to find a way of sort of bringing that into being?
No, not the task of the analyst. It is the task of the analysand.
Oh,
Yes,
the patient, yes, or the
yes, of the
analysis.
patient.
Yes,
Yes, the
okay.
task of the analysis itself. Yes.
Yes, okay, okay, okay. Um, if there's a question of the seminar itself, but not the seminar itself, but your experience of the seminar, not only as a reviewer, but imagining yourself, if you could, being somebody who's attending that seminar, what do you imagine, what would you have asked him? What questions did you have, or do you have for him still? How about the seminar?
Oh my goodness. That's an amazing question. I wasn't expecting that. You're that's a great question, Rodrigo. Um, I mean, I suppose I imagine actually I'd be far too intimidated to because the seminar was attended by hundreds and hundreds of people, and whether I don't think I would necessarily have been able to stand up and ask a question. But I suppose if I had a question to ask, it would be in some way connected to maybe what I'm working on at the time. I mean, I do think Lacan also has some interesting things to say about jouissance and the drive, particularly towards the latter part of the seminar. And uh, he talks about exhibitionism and voyeurism briefly, and sadism and masochism. I think with great clinical relevance. I mean, these are very short pieces, but absolutely not to be missed. I would certainly have asked him to say a little bit more about, for example, the role of the voice in masochism and in sadism, the role of the object voice, the drive voice, in as he refers to it. That's certainly a question that I'm interested in at the moment. But that that he talks about the masochist, for example, that for the masochist, it is a super ego that has not been integrated by the other. It's that type of voice. So I would love to ask him to say a little bit more about that. As he is, of course, himself speaking and voicing the seminar, as a master of voice and performance himself. I'm not equating Lacan, of course, with sadism and masochism, but it's very interesting, and I think has great clinical relevance.
Yes, and it relates to the work that you're doing these days or today. Maybe you could tell us some more about that. What are you doing? What are some of your projects? What are you writing? What are you teaching?
Well, as you mentioned in your very kind introduction there, I just finished an edited collection, co-edited with Helena Texier, revisiting Freud's principal case studies, and various Freudian Lacanian analysts, two analysts, review each of the 6 major case studies. So I've just finished that. That came out this summer, actually, a few months ago, and I'm currently working on another collection, James Joyce's Writing and Psychoanalysis, and this is a collection that came from a conference that we had in Dublin. It was the first conference, a gathering, once we were allowed to gather after the big restrictions of COVID. So there were some very interesting papers presented at this conference on Joyce's writing and psychoanalysis. So I'm putting together a collection on that, which I hope will be out next year in 2026. It's looking promising that will be the case. And I'm also working on my own book, which is on psychoanalysis and film, with a particular focus on Lacan's notion of the gaze. But you'll not be surprised to hear this: the voice is not far away from my thinking, and I'm also interested in that.
Oh, fantastic. And your clinical work in Ireland. I wonder if you could tell us also a little bit about that.
Yes, I can. I work in a busy city centre, Dublin city centre practice. I work in private practice, and I would say most of us in the practice are psychoanalysts, and it's a practice that works with effectively with everything from children to adolescents to adults. I work with adults and young adults. I will work with people as young adults, but I don't work with children. And it is a practice, I suppose, that it reflects, the pathologies and the ills and the humors of the contemporary world, and also reflects our healthcare system, which is a public healthcare system. I'm pleased to say we have a public healthcare system in Ireland, but that is overburdened and under-resourced when it comes to talk therapy. So the private sector is a very, very busy private sector, picking up where the public sector is simply not able to manage. And so there's a lot of work going on in the private sector, and unlike, I suppose, my understanding of how the private sector and psychoanalysis works here, I suppose psychoanalysts working in Ireland, the fees tend not to be particularly high. I mean, it is fees still that people have to come up with, but comparatively speaking to other jurisdictions, it's much more affordable. So more people can go. I say at the same time as well, and this is an important qualification, that psychoanalysis, I mean, Ireland is not like England, it's not like France, it's not like the US, where psychoanalysis has a place in the symbolic, where it's recognized as a distinct profession in its own right. Psychoanalysis in Ireland does not have that status, even though there are hundreds and hundreds of psychoanalysts working, but they're working as psychotherapists or as psychiatrists or guidance counselors. In our practice, people do refer to themselves as psychoanalysts or psychoanalytic psychotherapists, and they work psychoanalytically. But it is not a designated profession recognized in the symbolic as it is in other places. That comes with disadvantages. It also comes with some advantages.
Advantages
like freedom,
yeah,
to work,
yeah,
freedom from being overly regulated and monitored. Now that may change, but and it probably will change. But I don't want to give your readers the impression that psychoanalysis has a seat at the table in the field of mental health in Ireland as it does in the United States. It doesn't.
Yeah, I wonder, does it have a field like in the imaginary of the university, for example? I wonder if there's Lacanian studies, for example. Is that something that that gives a place for psychoanalysis, Lacanian psychoanalysis, within the cultural sphere? I know, for example, in Latin America, where there is presence of psychoanalysis, it tends to be less institutional or official, at least in the psychoanalytic symbolic. Lacanian schools of psychoanalysis are not so much in the fold, but they are everywhere in the university. Students know about Lacan because of what they read, the humanities and so forth, and they get very excited about Lacan and go to Lacanian institutes or Lacanian analysts that are outside of the symbolic in a way. And I wonder if in Ireland something similar happens.
Yes, I think you've hit the nail on the head. So certainly psychoanalysis has a foothold in the university. More work to be done there, certainly, but it does. And in fact, also clinical training is done through the university as well in Ireland, or at least the first steps on clinical training. But yes, it does. The work of Lacan does exist in the university. And it can be a way in which people are able to find a way in, those that might want to seek out an analysis, and some who may wish to also undertake a clinical training. So the academy has always been important for the work of Lacan. It's probably really been the saving of the work of Lacan in many places. And that is, I think, true in Ireland. And we're at an interesting time in that we're looking at I'm involved organisationally in Dublin, and it's an interesting moment in terms of training and the academy and an institute an institute. Ireland, there's no group or institute in Ireland that has ever been a member of the IPA. I don't know if in the island of Ireland. I don't know if you know that. So there's always been an autonomous or independent streak at work in the country. It's also been, particularly informed by a colonial history and a deeply religious history as well under Catholicism until recently. So the particularities to the Irish context that have meant that it has not been institutes have not been established in ways they have in other places. But we are at an interesting time now in terms of, I think we're at something of a crossroads around questions of training. So watch this space. We'll have to see what happens.
Yes, absolutely. Eva, thank you very much. I feel like we could go on talking for a lot longer than this, but I think we have to stop. Thank you very much. I think this was a delightful conversation. I really appreciate you being here with us.
Not at all. You're very welcome. And thank you for facilitating such a delightful conversation. Thank you, Rodrigo.